What gender-related issues are important for Shinto practitioners?
Shinto priests and priestesses have almost always been married people with families. Ongoing social taboo still prohibits menstruating women from participating as official ministers in ritual activities. Contemporary custom, however, has in all likelihood loosened such restrictions. It is safe to say that in general women have historically had greater direct participation in many Shinto shrine rituals than they do presently. Only unmarried young women are eligible for the office of Miko in shrines, and typically have access to the positions hereditarily, as a result of their family's priestly traditions.
How do Shinto practitioners deal ritually with death and mourning?
According to a saying, Shinto marries, Buddhism buries. During the Tokugawa era, 1600 to 1868, an imperial decree stipulated that only Buddhist priests should conduct funeral rites. Most cemeteries in Japan are connected to Buddhist temples rather than Shinto shrines. But there are exceptions to that general rule. And practitioners of Shinto have important beliefs and rituals concerning death and mourning. A major difference between Buddhist and Shinto practices is that Shinto rites never occur in shrines. 4 shrines are strictly dedicated to the kami. Shinto tradition regards death as a form of evil and a serious source of pollution. Shinto belief and practice has been profoundly influenced by certain Confucian attitudes toward departed ancestors. And large numbers of Japanese still perform rites of ancestor veneration. Some Japanese families still follow the practice of enshrining a deceased person's symbols in a spirit house. Tamiya, placed beneath the home's kamidana, 7 weeks after a funeral. Some of Japan's largest shrines are dedicated to memorializing the spirits of great human beings elevated to the status of kami. Grief, kibyaku, is associated with a prescribed period during which the experience of death renders family members impure. The bereaved family should stay away from shrines and refrain from Shinto ritual generally during that interval. In pre-Buddhist times, the Japanese sometimes constructed monumental memorials to the dead. Historically, lay people performed Shinto funeral rituals, with main participants wearing white. Today, Shinto rites, led by priests, occur in homes or funeral establishments. Some shrines continue to perform memorial rites for those who have died in battle.
What is a monk and how are Buddhist monasteries organized?
In its wider sense, monk refers to any male Buddhist who enters a monastic institution. Whether permanently or for a short time, receiving at least the lower ordination to the status of novice, Shramanera. Strictly speaking, A monk is a male at least 20 years old who has been in the monastery at least 5 years and received the higher ordination to the status of bhikshu, mendicant. Monasteries are generally independent and autonomous foundations. Rather like Benedictine monasteries in Roman Catholicism, a very loose analogy. Buddhist monasteries of the same lineage or order are administered separately. Each monastery's internal structure combines offices positions assigned by a monastic council or other governing body and ranks distinctions often based on seniority or spiritual acumen. Offices in a Japanese Zen monastery include, for example, chief abbot. In a complex with many sub-monasteries and temples, abbot, kancho, Zen master, Rashi, meditation leader and disciplinarian. Jikijutsu, in the Zendo or meditation hall, administrator of the Zendo, Jisha, and head cook. An important rank is that of head monk, Jushoku, who might also hold the office of abbot in a sub-temple. Similarly, in Thai Theravada monasteries offices include abbots and meditation masters, and recognize various ranks, such as those of elder, Thera, 10 years seniority, and great elder, Mahathera, with 20 years seniority.
Is there a central teaching or legislative authority for Jews?
During later biblical times, beginning around 200 BCE, a principal deliberative body of 71 members, called the Sanhedrin, Greek signed Ryan, handled all religious and secular matters of importance to Jewish life. Originally located in the Jerusalem Temple, the Sanhedrin remained active until around 425 CE. Membership consisted of 3 groups, at least during New Testament times. The elders who represented the major tribal clans and families, the high priests, including elders of the 4 priestly families as well as former high priests, and the scribes. Religious legal scholars belonging mostly to the sect known as the Pharisees. The high priest, or Nasai, was chosen from descendants of Moses' brother Aaron and governed the council. While the Sanhedrin did function as a court of law in exceptional cases, it was concerned mostly with larger administrative and juridical issues. Meanwhile, the Bet Din, literally, house of judgment, generally adjudicated legal questions, including both religious and civil matters affecting the Jewish community exclusively. Roman law allowed for a large measure of internal rule among Jewish subjects. The Bet Din required at least 3, male judges but handled criminal cases with as many as 23 judges. The class of religious scholars known as the 5 pairs of teachers bore special responsibility for the 2 legal bodies. Hillel, Nasai, and Shammai, A.V. Bet Din, Chief Justice of the Court, were the last of the pairs. In this separation of civil and religious spheres, the high priest generally retained final authority. Though the Sanhedrin did not survive into late antiquity, the Bet Din remained vital through the Middle Ages. and still functions as arbiter of personal status law for Israeli Jews, with the chief rabbi presiding. During later antiquity, c. 500-1000, the scholarly class called the Janim, eminences, functioned as a major authority for Middle Eastern and European Jews by publishing their rulings in documents called responsa. For Jewish communities in Iraq, land of the exile, the position of exilarch, Resh Galuta, head of those in exile, generally occupied by laymen, continued to wield some authority until about the mid-13th century. For many generations, even up to early modern times, the Kehila, or local Jewish community organization, was the principal decision-making body.
What are some of the main varieties of Jewish religious officials or specialists?
During biblical times, the centralized cult of the temple in Jerusalem required a large and elaborate system of specialists and functionaries. Special roles were assigned to tribes, and to certain clans and families within the tribes. Destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE brought dramatic change in its wake, including a great simplification in ritual practice. The shift to local synagogue worship naturally required the development of a local officialdom whose duties would include presiding over much smaller scale ritual and, at the same time, looking after the more comprehensive spiritual needs of a local community for whom the synagogue was now the focus of religious life. The rabbi, Hebrew for my master, is the principal religious authority and community representative in contemporary Judaism as well as the primary leader of synagogue worship. The latter function seems to be a relatively modern development, with emphasis in earlier post-biblical eras on the rabbi as scholar and teacher. In some regions, rabbinical conferences or other organizations may elect or appoint one of their members to serve as chief rabbi. Most synagogues and local communities divide duties among several other offices. One of the more important is that of the cantor, Hazan. Often a person of considerable musical ability and training whose duty is to chant sacred text and to sing special prayers for the various religious observances. The position has been especially necessary in communities whose members generally do not read Hebrew. In late antiquity, the term Hazan referred to several community functions, but later it was applied exclusively to the cantor, Shaliach Zaber. Throughout Jewish history, many rabbis have served as cantors in their synagogues, but rabbi cantors are now less common. In some congregations, a layperson called the Gabbai, overseer, roughly, has the duty of commissioning Torah readers for each service.
Where do Shinto practitioners live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
By far the majority of people who identify themselves with Shinto tradition still live in Japan. There are also Shinto shrines in many areas of Asia, and a few elsewhere as well, in which significant Japanese communities have developed. Honolulu's Shinto shrine, for example, is a highly visible sign of a large and prosperous Japanese community there. Accurate statistics as to membership are hard to come by, largely because an increasing number of Japanese do not identify themselves as religious at all, even if they continue to engage in some traditional Shinto practices. We do, however, have fairly reliable information about numbers of shrines and active priests from which we have some idea of the tradition's vitality today. Some 20,000 priests serve between 80,000 and 100,000 shrines.
What is the freedom of religion in the 20th century?
In March of 1981, after more than 30 years of failed attempts, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights completed a draft declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. After approval by the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly on November 25. 1981. The declaration is a short document with 8 articles. It states that no one should be subject to discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief. That such discrimination should be condemned as a human rights violation. That states should act to prevent and eliminate such discrimination, and that the parents or legal guardians of a child have the right to organize life within the family in accordance with their religion or belief. Although religious liberty was deemed to be better protected by underspecification than by overspecification, the Declaration does enumerate 9 freedoms. Article 6 describes the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as including, but not limited to, the following freedoms: to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief and to establish and maintain places for these purposes. To establish and maintain appropriate charitable or humanitarian institutions. To make, acquire, and use to an adequate extent the necessary articles and materials related to the rites or customs of a religion or belief. To write, issue, and disseminate relevant publications in these areas. To teach a religion or belief in places suitable for these purposes. To solicit and receive voluntary financial and other contributions from individuals and institutions, to train, appoint, elect, or designate by succession appropriate leaders called for by the requirements and standards of any religion or belief. To observe days of rest and to celebrate holidays and ceremonies in accordance with the precepts of one's religion or belief, and to establish and maintain communications with individuals and communities in matters of religion or belief at the national and international levels.
What is the harrowing of hell?
According to ancient Christian creeds, Jesus Christ descended into hell after his death on the cross. Some traditions associate this curious visit to the abyss or nether world with Christ's ultimate victory over evil as well as death. But the majority opinion is that Christ descended not into hell, the place or state of eternal torment and punishment, but to that intermediate realm in which all just persons who had died previously awaited the coming of Christ. According to that view, Christ descended in order to lead those righteous souls heavenward.
When and where did Judaism begin? Was it founded by an individual person?
Jewish tradition traces its beginnings back nearly 4,000 years. Abraham is the key figure here. Not as a founder but as the first Hebrew to receive a revelation from God. Genesis 11-25 contain the bulk of our scriptural information about Abraham. According to tradition, God told Abraham to leave his homeland in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. Trusting completely in God, the patriarch was to travel where God would lead him. As Abraham journeyed across the central Middle East from Mesopotamia to Egypt and back to what is now southern Israel, he and his son Isaac lay the foundations of a monotheistic tradition. Abraham's grandson Jacob sired the 12 sons who would bestow their names on the original 12 tribes. The second half of Genesis recounts their stories. But the appearance of Moses, beginning with the story of his being adopted by Pharaoh, marks another major turning point. Moses lived probably toward the end of the third quarter of the second millennium BCE, about 1300 BCE. His story occupies a larger portion of the Jewish scriptures than any other single figure. Stretching from the beginning of Exodus to the end of Deuteronomy. From his inaugural revelation at the burning bush to his leading the people called Israel. The special name divinely given to the patriarch Jacob. At last to the banks of the Jordan, Moses' story is that of the formation of a community of faith. At the center of that formative epoch is the pivotal revelation of the law at Sinai at about the midpoint of that journey. Sources do not record use of the word Jew. From the Hebrew Yehudi, until many centuries after Moses' time. Then the word referred to a member of the tribe of Judah, which in turn had given its name to the region called Judea.
What were the ancient Greek gods and myths?
Between approximately 850 BCE and 500 BCE, there arose a new Greek religion based on the god Zeus and on 11 other gods who resided on Mount Olympus in Thessaly, in northeastern Greece. The Greek gods were adopted later by the Romans and given different names. The 12 gods made up a family: Zeus, Jupiter to the Romans, the ruler, his brothers Poseidon, Neptune, and Hades, Pluto, their sister Hestia, Vesta, who later gave up her place to Zeus's son Dionysus, Bacchus, Zeus's wife Hera, Juno, their son Ares, Mars, Zeus's children Athena, Minerva. Apollo, Aphrodite, Venus, Hermes, Mercury, and Artemis, Diana, and Hera's son Hephaestus, Vulcan. These Olympians were concerned with and controlled the fate of humankind. Many minor gods were believed to reside on earth and to play a part in the drama of the Olympians and their interaction with the Greek mortals. Zeus sometimes fathered children by mortal women, and the sons became the heroes of Greek legend. The Greeks worshipped their gods as a regular part of their everyday lives. They were careful to please the gods in their actions and were especially careful to avoid angering them. When disaster befell their cities or crops, or when sickness took the lives of loved ones, they believed the wrath of the gods was responsible. The Greek gods also had a humorous side, and the mortals were able to laugh at the gods' plots against one another and at their concealed love affairs. The Greek and Roman myths concerning the activities of the gods and mortals are considered some of the world's greatest literature. Outstanding examples include the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. These and other works presented the ideals of physical beauty and heroic deeds in a poetic form that has inspired civilization since their creation.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT believe in miracles?
Devout Chinese, whether associated with Daoism or with some form of CCT, consider asking for special favors an ordinary part of being religious. In general, however, what many readers mean by the term miraculous would not quite describe even apparently spectacular results of supplicatory prayer and ritual in this context. A fundamental consequence of the yin/yang view of life is the conviction that there is an identifiable cause of everything, whether positive or negative. All evil, illness, and suffering is a result of disharmony and imbalance. It is true that ordinary people cannot always put their finger on the direct cause, but ritual specialists know about these things. More importantly, the gods and those spiritual beings who have found the secret of immortality can assist suffering humankind by bringing about needed balance and harmony of forces. A miracle in this context, therefore, might be a divine intervention not for the purpose of doing the impossible, but for helping the possible to happen more quickly and easily.
Is there such a thing as a Buddhist saint?
Nearly all of the Mahayana denominations look to special embodiments of holiness for guidance, inspiration, and even the occasional miracle. Japanese Buddhists call some of these figures shonin, an honorific designation bestowed especially on patriarchs and founders of lineages and denominations. A group called the 18 Lohans, Lohan is derived from the Sanskrit term arhat, are set apart from the Buddha's earliest disciples as uniquely sacred because of their unselfish commitment to spreading the Dharma rather than retire into peaceful solitude. Theravada tradition still uses the term arhat, worthy one, to refer to a living embodiment of sanctity and wisdom. But the arhat remains an ethical model only, and a rather distant ideal at that. Mahayana teaching sees the bodhisattva as the ultimate in human potential. Some even confer the title on living individuals, such as the Dalai Lama. Bodhisattvas not only model spiritual perfection, but function as mediators as well. As emissaries of the various Buddhas. They exercise saving power and make comforting grace available to all who ask.
Is belief the same as faith?
There is a distinction between belief and faith. Belief, understood either generally or as a reference to a particular tenet, refers to the content of a tradition's central teaching. When believers recite a creed, for example, they affirm that they share a certain set of beliefs. Faith is the act or process of relying on or assenting to realities that one might not be able to prove as easily as one might like. People talk about acts of faith and often describe faith as a leap into the unknown, or as a kind of fundamental trust. Not every belief or act of faith is necessarily religious. Beliefs of every description rule our daily lives. They all the millions of things we take for granted, like gravity and sunrise. And no one could get past breakfast without a basic level of trust. Religious belief and faith can seem riskier, because their objects are often not subject to the validation of actual experience. But what finally distinguishes religious belief and faith from their more mundane counterparts is that religious believers are willing to live without conclusive proof indefinitely.
How did conservative Judaism get its name?
Many 20th-century European and American Jews have agreed that orthodoxy must adapt to changing times, but have found some modifications introduced by leaders of Reform Judaism too dramatic. Conservatives have thus become Judaism's mid-ground. Responding to the Reformers' Pittsburgh platform of 1885, Sabato More 1823 to 1897, joined other Reform rabbis to found the Jewish Theological Seminary of America as a way of promoting a middle path between orthodoxy and reform. They stressed the progressive nature of the faith while retaining traditional practices. Like the Reformers, conservatives allowed some English prayers as well as organ music, and did not separate the sexes, and they taught immortality of the soul but not resurrection of the body. In 1924 the Rabbinical Assembly of America became conservative Judaism's institutional anchor in this country. Conservatives retain the orthodox emphasis on scripture as normative, along with the bulk of its traditional interpretation. They do, however, make allowances for adaptation to modern needs, such as driving to synagogue on Sabbath. But while traditionalists among them insist that the revelation of Sinai was complete and definitive in itself, more liberal conservatives lean toward the idea that divine revelation is an unfolding process. Conservatives make up the second largest body of American Jews, numbering over 1.5 million with about 800 synagogues. Zionism has had many staunch supporters among conservative Jews.
Are there mythic elements in Jewish tradition?
Many texts in the Hebrew Bible suggest associations with ancient mythic narrative. Not so much in what they discuss as in the way they express it. The paired creation stories in Genesis preserve mythic elements in their description of the watery chaos that existed prior to God's imposing upon it the order of a cosmos. These texts probe the mysteries of the origins of all things. Similarly, blended twin accounts of destruction by a universal flood in Genesis also hint at mythic underpinnings. The Book of Job's grand panorama of the divine work uses analogous imagery and conveys an unmistakable note of majesty and splendor. At the other end of the timeline of creation are the apocalyptic texts, in books such as Ezekiel and Daniel, for example, that describe the inevitable cataclysmic events that will herald the completion of history. To describe the biblical text as sharing important features with myth in no way impugns or discredits the scripture. It is merely a way of characterizing how the Hebrew Bible communicates in several key accounts.
How do Confucians deal ritually with death and mourning?
Confucian practices associated with funerals and ancestor veneration are of a piece with those of Daoism and CCT, in that the basic elements are common to most segments of traditional Chinese societies. Confucius and his disciples did have some specific thoughts on the matter, though. Disciple Sun Zi wrote that the feelings of loss and longing for a deceased person, and the ritual expression of those feelings, represented the height of human civilization and culture. In a way, one knows the humanity of others through the attachment they express for lost loved ones. Although Confucius himself declined to speculate about the experience of death or the condition of one who has died, he seems to have felt strongly that there were appropriate ritual and emotional responses. When asked whether he recommended the full 3-year period of mourning, Confucius responded that if literati who lose loved ones were to dispense with the practice, they would risk the irrevocable loss of some of society's most important rituals. He added that if the questioner felt comfortable performing only a year's grieving, he might do so. After the questioner had left, however, the teacher commented how heartless such a person must be. Parents attend to their infants unceasingly for 3 years. the least their children can do is return the favor symbolically. One specific issue that has historically been very important for Confucianism and CIT is the question of monumental funereal architecture and special memorials for the great and powerful. Confucius and several of the tradition's later teachers have been remembered with fairly modest grave markers. Tombs of emperors, on the other hand, have often been grand, even extravagant, architectural works. At least one ruler even commissioned a virtual reconstruction of the royal residence underground, complete with thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers to protect the imperial remains.
What are some basic Hindu ethical considerations?
Hindu tradition describes a range of morally and religiously acceptable goals or motives for action. What matters most is not the substance of the particular type of goal, but the quality of one's intentions. All good things in life are gifts of God. One has only to learn how best to use and value them. In the greater scheme of things, 3 of the 4 major goals are means rather than ends in themselves. Even so, a devout Hindu can pursue them with vigor and determination. As long as the pursuit is balanced and not obsessive. Most fundamental is the goal of Dharma, the quest for one's own individual ethical calling in accord with the cosmic law that holds all things together. Personal justice and righteousness are the cardinal virtues. But wealth, material success, power, and social status, artha, are also worthy goals, so long as one keeps them in perspective. People who use their worldly success in ethically laudable ways are exercising responsible stewardship and can make wonderful things happen for the benefit of many. In addition, a devout Hindu can enjoy to the full all of life's legitimate pleasures. Kama, associated with culture, the arts, sexuality, and family life. This traditional teaching undercuts the common stereotype of Hinduism as world-rejecting and self-denying asceticism. On the other hand, the opposite stereotype that identifies Hinduism as the kind of wild-eyed lust sometimes associated with the Kama Sutra is equally inappropriate. Ultimately, Hindu tradition teaches the sincere seeker will find that none of the first 3 goals offers permanent satisfaction. What remains is the quest for final liberation from the enslavement that goes with even well-moderated attachments. Moksha, meaning release, is the only goal worthy of being considered an end in itself. Most people will spend many lifetimes striving for it.
Where do Hindus live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
India is home to the vast majority, about 95%, of the world's nearly 1 billion Hindus. Other significant minority populations have Hindu communities in more than half a dozen other lands. Almost 24 million Hindus are Nepalese. Over 12 million live in Bangladesh, nearly 6 million in Indonesia, some 2 million in the United States, and approaching 1.5 million each in Malaysia, Pakistan, South Africa, and England. Virtually every nation on earth now has representatives of Hinduism among its citizenry. Hindus are about 200 million fewer than Muslims, half the total global population of Christians, and somewhere between 2 and 3 times that of Buddhism.
Do Hindus pray in any particular language?
Sanskrit remains the official sacred language of Hindu liturgical ritual. Ancestor of a number of modern Indian languages, Sanskrit is also linguistically connected with classical languages such as Latin and Greek, and with modern languages such as Persian and a host of European tongues. Many Hindus still learn a little Sanskrit, not through formal language instruction, but through the use of ritual phrases and prayers. During temple rituals, the priests typically recite sometimes lengthy texts from the Vedas in a chant using 4 or 5 tones. When families offer puja at home, the prayer leader often recites a number of short standard prayers in Sanskrit. Devotional hymns and prayers in a number of regional Indian vernacular languages, such as Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, and Bengali, as well as in India's official national language, Hindi, are standards in many ritual settings.
Why is the Quran important for Muslims?
Muslims believe the beautiful prose of the Quran to be the words of God Himself, who spoke through Muhammad. Further, it is believed to be only a copy of an eternal book, which is kept by Allah. The Quran is also held up by Muslims as proof that Muhammad was indeed a prophet, since no human is capable of composing such text. Among the most widely read texts today, the Quran is also taught orally, so that even Muslims who are illiterate and do not speak Arabic might learn to recite the most important verses in Arabic.
What role do views of the material world play in Shinto tradition?
Shinto is one of the world's most ecologically attuned religious traditions. Divine energy suffuses all of creation and is thus cause for reverence and wonder. Very optimistic in its outlook about life in this world, Shinto teaches that when human beings are in harmony with nature, all persons and things flourish. There is therefore no serious distinction or incompatibility between the physical and the spiritual, the human and the divine. Shinto is very much what some call a world-affirming tradition. When devotees worship at a shrine, the mood is generally solemn and reverent, but a sense of joy and exuberance pervades festivals. Such celebrations, which can go on for days, leave little doubt that at the heart of Shinto tradition, there is a delight in the everyday world and a conviction of the inherent goodness of creation.
What is the imperial oath in Japan?
The following oath is taken from the 1889 Constitution of the Empire of Japan. It was spoken by the Emperor in the sanctuary of the Imperial Palace. We, the successor to the prosperous throne of our predecessors, do humbly and solemnly swear to the imperial founder of our house, and to our other imperial ancestors that, in pursuance of a great policy coextensive with the heavens and with the earth, we shall maintain and secure from decline the ancient form of government. In consideration of the progressive tendency of the course of human affairs and in parallel with the advance of civilization, we deem it expedient, in order to give clearness and distinctness to the instructions bequeathed by the imperial founder of our house and by our other imperial ancestors, to establish fundamental laws formulated into express provisions of law, so that, on the one hand, our imperial posterity may possess an express guide for the course they are to follow, and that, on the other, our subjects shall thereby be enabled to enjoy a wider range of action in giving us their support, and that the observance of our laws shall continue to the remotest ages of time. We will thereby give greater firmness to the stability of our country, and promote the welfare of all the people within the boundaries of our dominions. And we now establish the imperial house law and the constitution. These laws come to only an exposition of grand precepts for the conduct of the government, bequeathed by the imperial founder of our house and by our other imperial ancestors, that we have been so fortunate in our reign, in keeping with the tendency of the times, as to accomplish this work. We owe to the glorious spirits of the imperial founder of our house and of our other imperial ancestors. We now reverently make our prayer to them and to our illustrious father, and implore the help of their sacred spirits, and make to them solemn oath never at this time nor in the future to fail to be an example to our subjects in the observance of the laws hereby established. May the heavenly spirits witness this our solemn oath.
What are the high holy days?
The autumnal holy days begin with Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the year. On the first and second days of Tishri, ushered in with the sound of the ram's horn. Shofar, as a symbol of divine sovereignty over the universe. This begins a period in which people make an accounting of how they have cared for creation entrusted to them. On the third day of Tishri comes the fast of Gedaliah, Tzim Gedaliah, on which Jews recall the end of the first Jewish commonwealth, 2 Kings 25:25. But the culmination of the period occurs on the 10th day of Tishri in a major fast observing the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. This day features 5 worship services and includes a communal confession. On the evening before, a cantor prays the very moving Kol Nidrei, all the vows, which annuls all rashly made promises of the previous year. Emphasis is on forgiveness of all wrongdoing. Regular morning prayer begins the next day, followed by additional prayers later in the morning focus specially on this feast. Afternoon prayer is followed by a service that recalls the closing of the temple gate in olden days and includes the Amidah, a litany called Our Father, Our King, the Shema, and a concluding sound of the ram's horn. The 5 services virtually flow from one to the next, making for a very full day of prayer.
Is there a central teaching authority for Christians? What is a pope?
Not since very early in Christian history have all, or at least the vast majority of, Christians acknowledged a central temporal authority. The role of the papacy through the centuries has been central to the story of pre-Reformation Christendom especially, and even churches that eventually repudiated papal authority were indirectly acknowledged the importance of the institution. Roman Catholic tradition is structured around the institution of the papacy. Popes have exercised varying degrees of independence in their governance, depending on the will and vigor of the Church's bishops in any given period. Eastern Orthodox churches have had their unique authority structures in the form of a federation of 14 independent autocephalies, 4 of which are the patriarchates of early Christian times, each further divided into eparchies, or dioceses. Since the Reformation, proliferation of Christian churches and denominations has spurred the development of a variety of governance styles and systems within individual denominations, such as the Baptist, and even their sub-denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention. Governing bodies do not always exercise overall prescriptive control. Their central authority is in many cases largely advisory. Since local church communities in many denominations enjoy considerable autonomy, both structurally and financially,
Does millennialism have a place in Buddhist thinking?
Buddhist interpretations of history, like those of Hindu tradition generally, are relatively unconcerned with notions like beginnings, progress, and endings. Time is so much grander than any human mind can fathom. Unimaginably large cycles give way to more of the same. But just as Hindu explanations of cosmic cycles can include a sense of expectation, so Buddhist tradition also makes room for a kind of Adventist thinking. Buddhists call the spiritual person or power whose future coming holds hope for all believers Maitreya, the benevolent one. 5,000 years after the death of this age's historical Buddha, the one originally called Siddhartha Gautama, Maitreya will enter the world of time and change. At present Maitreya lives as a bodhisattva in the heaven called Tushita. Contented ones, the celestial realm reserved for future Buddhas. Both Theravada and Mahayana traditions give Maitreya an important role. But devotion to this bodhisattva is much more developed in several Mahayana denominations. Classical Chinese teachings regarded Maitreya as a savior figure. But the cult of Amitabha gradually displaced that of Maitreya. Tibetan tradition holds that Maitreya will arrive in 30,000 years to teach all people. This bodhisattva has a long history of popular devotion in Korea and Japan under the name Myruk or Moroku. Colossal statues of Myruk stand on Korean hillsides and in temple compounds, some visible for several miles. And in Japan, Kyoto's ancient Kyuji temple enshrines an exquisite 6th century statue of Moroku. Gazing down on all who enter, the beautiful and very feminine-looking Moroku radiates compassion. Moving from the sublime to the deliberately ridiculous. A comical figure called Milo in China and Hodai in Japan represents another facet of Maitreya altogether. Hodai is depicted as a fat, jovial, scantily clad character. He is actually a Chinese Zen monk named Putai who claimed to be a manifestation of Maitreya.
How important was the school of national learning?
National learning, or Kokyugaku, had perhaps more to do with the modern understanding of Shinto than has any other movement within the tradition. Katen no Azumamaro, 1669–1736, is generally considered the founder of the school, insisting on the need to return to the earliest genuinely and purely Japanese sources. Among those he included the Kyojiki, but emphasized the Kojiki and Nihongi especially. Komo no Mabuchi, 1697–1769. Continued what Kata had begun by applying philological methods to classical Japanese prayer and poetry. He considered spontaneity the native Japanese gift, without which nothing could be truly Japanese. Motori Norinaga, 1730–1801, continued the scholarly dynasty, and is still regarded by some as Shinto's best theological mind. His 44-volume commentary on the Kojiki remains a monument of scholarship. Hirata Itsutane, 1763–1843, was the latest and perhaps most influential exponent of the school, in that he implemented the thought of his predecessor Motori. Together these four men were largely responsible for the articulation of modern Shinto's highly nationalistic and ethnocentric tone.
Is education especially important in Confucianism?
No major religious tradition has placed greater emphasis on education than Confucianism. That is not to suggest that Confucian teaching reduces the truth to mere intellectual development. For Confucians, education goes far beyond developing mental skills and acquiring information. It means the cultivation of the whole person within. The broadest possible perspective humanism under heaven. A number of very important Confucian institutions of higher learning have made major contributions throughout Asia over the centuries. Perhaps even more pervasive has been the Confucian influence in the development and maintenance of China's imperial civil service system. The educational system that produced and regulated the social class called the literati.
What were the earliest Hindu sacred texts?
A set of sacred scriptures, called the Vedas, consists of 4 distinct collections of texts, each with its own distinctive purpose. The name Veda comes from a Sanskrit root meaning wisdom or vision. The same root that gives us English words like video. According to tradition, seers, called rishis, composed the texts and communicated them orally. The rishis were able to see the truths revealed to them because they were also hearers of the sacred word. In fact, Hindu tradition groups the most sacred of its scriptures in the category of that which is heard, Shruti, to distinguish them from a secondary level of revelation called that which is remembered, Smriti. The Vedas evolved over a period of centuries, and religious specialists eventually wrote them down in an ancient form of Sanskrit. The earliest and most important of the 4 scriptures is called the Rig Veda, an anthology of more than 1,000 hymns to various deities. A second collection, called the Samaveda, includes material from the Rig, edited for ease of ritual use according to melodies and poetic meters. In the Yajur Veda, the early priesthood gathered the most important sacred mantras. A final collection of ritual incantations makes up the Atharva Veda. Many of the Vedic hymns are especially beautiful and offer a unique insight into how the early ritual specialists who made up the priesthood sought to understand and affect their world through contact with forces beyond human control.
What is the Forbidden City?
A sprawling complex of over half a mile square in the heart of Beijing has been known for centuries as the Forbidden City. Some 1,400 royal rooms, all in single-story buildings, cover 180 acres. Yang Li, 1403–1424 CE, 3rd Emperor of the Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644. Founded the Forbidden City as his seat of government when he moved his capital from Nanjing to Beijing. From this heart of imperial Beijing radiates a network of sacred sites toward the 4 directions. Aligned along the city's main north-south axis are the principal residential and ritual structures. The palaces of the inner court to the north and the halls of public ceremony forming the outer court further south. To the east and west are the dozens of subordinate residential and administrative buildings. In a massive plaza before the southernmost ritual space, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. An artificial river runs east to west. 5 small bridges, symbolizing the 5 Confucian virtues, span it. In the various halls along the main axis all the great rituals celebrating the empire took place. In overall symbolism, the Forbidden City reproduced on earth the court from which the heavenly emperor, Shangdi, ruled the universe. Beijing was the last of a series of walled royal capitals. Beginning as far back as 1700 BCE, cities such as Anyang, Chang'an, and Hangzhou all had their sacred centers. Beijing saw the abdication of its last emperor in 1912.
Do Hindus consider pilgrimage important?
In a land with countless sacred places associated with numerous divine names and forms, pilgrimage, yatra, going out, remains an essential expression of religious devotion for all who can afford it. For those whose modest means prevent them from traveling distances, a pilgrimage to closer sites is always a possibility. In ancient times Hindu pilgrimages may have been related to the increasing popularity of sites associated with sacred events in the life of the Buddha. Among the most important goals of pilgrimage are the sources and confluences of major rivers. With its many important temples of Shiva and Kali, as well as the bathing and cremation ghats that line its Ganges banks, Benares tops the list of pilgrimage cities. A 36-mile circuit around the city still attracts many travelers in search of blessing and forgiveness. Other important sites include those associated with events in the life of Krishna.
Do Buddhists believe in an afterlife?
Although the Buddha himself emphasized the need to focus on this worldly concerns, his followers soon developed a complex understanding of the spiritual structure of the universe. According to both Theravada and Mahayana models, all of reality is divided into 3 realms. The realm of desire, Kamadhatu, encompasses everything from innumerable hells through the dwelling places of animals, humans, lesser gods, and the various paradises in which good people can expect to enjoy the fruits of a good life. Each level of hell is suited to a particular kind of selfishness and evil. The heavens are similarly graded for the enjoyment of the just. A certain sexist attitude is built into the notion of paradise, since in order to gain entry into the highest heaven women must first be reborn as men. Those reborn into the next major level up, the realm of form, Rupadhatu, leave behind the senses of taste, touch, and smell. Through hearing, sight, and mental impressions they continue the ongoing process of spiritual refinement and education. Denizens of this realm's multiple heavens, From 16 to 18, progress upward through various stages of contemplative discipline. Arriving finally at the third cosmic realm, that of non-form, Arupatatu. Dispensing with sight and hearing, dwellers in this realm progress through 4 aditonal heavens through meditation, arriving at last at nirvana. Beyond that, according to some Mahayana schools, lie several Buddha fields. Transcendent Buddhas, such as Amitabha, in China, Amida in Japan, reign over their individual Buddha fields. Amitabha's is the western paradise called the Pure Land. Popular belief suggests that devotees can bypass the lower intermediate steps and progress directly to this final abode merely by expressing perfect faith in the transcendent Buddha.
Who are the Shaivites?
At least 6 sub-denominations make up Shaiva Hinduism. As with Vaishnavism, their views on the nature of the divine-human relationship set them apart. A major sect in South and Southeast Indian region called Tamil Nadu is known as Shiva Siddhanta, truth about Shiva. Tracing its roots to Rishi Termular, c. 200 CE, the group's central teaching is a blend of theism and monism, individual souls seek God. And devotees and worshippers in this life and ultimately will merge totally with Shiva. Pashupata Shaivism, founded by Lakolasha, c. 200, and popular in far northeast, north, and western central India, holds a variation on that teaching. Souls finally merge with God but maintain individuality somewhat. As stars are lost as discrete bodies in the infinite night sky. Also found in the northern state of Kashmir is a distinctive Shaiva sect founded by Vasugupta, c. 800 CE. The Kashmiri school is monistic, teaching the complete and perfect oneness of all reality in Shiva. A major sect in northeast India is called Siddha Siddhanta, with roots in the teaching or Rishi Gorakshanatha. c. 950 CE. Blending theism and monism. This school says all individual things are eventually reabsorbed into Shiva as bubbles arise in water. A minor group still influential in southern India is called Shiva Advaita. Its first teacher, Shrikanta, c. 1050. Preferred a qualified theism in which the worshipper participates in divinity without losing identity. Finally, a major sect in southwest Indian is known as Virashaivism. Members are sometimes referred to as Lingayats because many carry with them in a small case a miniature Shiva Linga. A major poet called Basavana, 1105–67, remains an influential source of the sect's teaching of qualified theism, according to which God is like the sun, souls its rays.
What is ancestor veneration and what is its connection with Daoism or CCT?
Concern over maintaining the integrity of one's connections with family. Lineage is one of the hallmarks of Chinese religious and social life. Members of each family line male descendants from a shared ancestor, with wives attached to their husband's line, acknowledge both the continued spiritual presence and the sacredness of their forebears. Their reasons are many: expression of grief, assistance of the deceased in his or her struggles beyond the grave, the desire for blessings, feeling a sense of family cohesiveness, showing continued affection for the dead. Long after the funeral and an extended period of official mourning, families pay homage to the dead both at the cemetery and at the ancestral shrine in the home. There, on the altar table, the family preserves a set of tablets, each with the name of one deceased relative inscribed on it. In very wealthy families of times past, the oldest son would dedicate his life to looking after the proper performance of the rites, foregoing virtually all other activities. For most families today, ongoing activities include chiefly the regular visits to the cemetery, annual refurbishment of the grave for the feast called Clear and Bright, Qingming, and daily prayers at the home shrine. At home, family members make the same kinds of symbolic offerings to the ancestors as to the deities enshrined on the domestic altar. Very wealthy families have often built special ancestral temples as major monuments to the spiritual power of the dead. Few, if any, of these practices or specific concerns are uniquely deist. It is all part of the broadly Chinese religious patrimony, with some elements perhaps more closely linked to CCT than to any specific major tradition.
Do Buddhists engage in ritual sacrifice?
Sacrifice has never been part of mainstream Buddhist ritual. The Buddha himself rejected the ancient Hindu sacrificial heritage as spiritually bankrupt, as did many others among his contemporaries. Some later popular devotional Hindu sects retained animal sacrifice as an essential feature of ritual. But Theravada and Mahayana popular devotion have, in effect, spiritualized the concept of sacrifice. Traditional forms of sacrifice typically aim to appease a divine power. Buddhist tradition virtually does away with the concept. When worshippers make offerings of flowers, incense, and other symbols, they are not giving gifts to a spiritual power but offering signs of reverence and providing reminders for themselves of life's impermanence.
Are there special rituals associated with dedicating a new temple?
Multiple festivities typically attend the formal consecration of a new temple and its sacred icons. It begins with the careful choice of a site on which the building can be aligned on an east-west axis with all interior shrines facing east. After the structure is completed, temple staff and devotees install permanent images of the deities in an elaborate 3 or 4 day ceremony called Kumbhabhishekam, sprinkling of water from pots filled at sacred rivers. Rituals begin with purification of the images with various special substances. Milk and clarified butter called ghee. Before fixing each image to its pedestal with ritually prepared adhesives, celebrants immerse it in water, grain, and flower petals. Special Vedic chants accompany an offering of ghee to a sacred fire to make up for any imperfection in the image. Then officiants pour water over the finial atop the womb chamber of each image, and over the images themselves in the actual ritual called Kumbhabhishekam. Since the images need eyes with which to see devotees, priests place eyes of semi-precious stones into the statues and pray that they be opened. To call the images to life, they then perform a ritual that instills breath in them. Before engaging further in the ordinary forms of daily worship, officiants symbolize the great sanctity of the images so dedicated by turning their backs to the images and looking at their reflection in a mirror. Thereafter devotees may gaze directly on the images. These festivities proceed all day long for as many as 4 days, perhaps more in some places, giving even devotees who live at a distance plenty of opportunity to participate. It is a most joyous occasion and a celebration of community to which, in most cases, any interested party is welcome. Many temples also celebrate the anniversary of their foundations or dedications.